Hey everyone, John here! And step into my time machine a second, okay? Because we're going back to March 3rd, 2017, when the most versatile console of all time launched, the Nintendo Switch. And it came with the most versatile launch title of all time, being Breath of the Wild. You could have this and nothing else for the entire year, and you'd still be finding new things and new excitements in this game. It was entirely player-controlled. You can go in any direction you want and find something new, something important. That's why this game was such a great marriage for the Switch hardware. You could just take it in and out of standby mode, wherever you were, and just keep on playing, because nothing really interrupts Breath of the Wild. It was the perfect game for this console, and it's the reason this system was so successful in the first place. In its first month, in March 2017, the Nintendo Switch sold 2.74 million consoles, but what's fascinating is in America, Breath of the Wild had a 102% attach rate, meaning it sold more than the Switch in March of 2017 in America. So the Switch sold 906,000 copies, or 1,000 units, and Breath of the Wild sold 925,000 copies. I don't know how that's possible, but it did. Everyone wanted Breath of the Wild. This was the reason you bought the Switch. Everybody who bought the console bought this game. They came together. But when you look at the Switch's 2017 from a retrospective point of view, people will generally go, Breath of the Wild, Mario Odyssey, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Splatoon 2, Mario plus Rabbids, Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And yeah, it's great that the console had so many system-defining games in its first year. But honestly, it's a little underwhelming looking at it like that, because it doesn't tell the full story. Yes, it had these big Nintendo games month after month, but between that, what were you doing? What did you do between Breath of the Wild and Mario Kart 8? Especially when you were a Wii U owner who'd already played Mario Kart 8. What kept you going between Breath of the Wild and the brand new game, ARMS? What kept you active? What were you playing in that time? And I think that's the thing a lot of people forget, is the Switch didn't just launch with Breath of the Wild. It didn't just launch with 1-2 Switch. The Switch actually had a really great launch. And I feel like most people who were dedicated to the system probably had these three games here. Snip Eclipse, Bomberman R, and Puyo Puyo Tetris. All of these games sold incredibly well. So the Puyo Puyo Tetris series, being 1 and 2, has sold over 3 million, but this is the one that most people bought. It sold over 1 million on Switch alone in its first year, and it went on to sell even more than that over time. But the reason people were buying things like Puyo Puyo Tetris was they just wanted to do something with their Switch. The Switch was such a cool console. It made gaming so freeing. You can just play it anywhere you want, and people were buying practically everything that launched on this thing. And it's not like today where you go on the eShop and there's 50 new games every week. No, you'd get like 10 new games a month. And so many people were gravitating to a huge chunk of these. You probably had Graceful Explosion Machine. You probably had I Am Setsuna. You probably had Blaster Master Zero. You probably had Far Star MX. You probably had Shovel Knight Spectre of Torment. People were playing a lot of indie games on this system, and there were a lot of success stories. Do you remember Kamiko? Kamiko was a pretty cheap game on the eShop, but it was this beautiful pixel art, Hyperlight Drifter-esque game, and it sold 250,000 copies for an unknown indie IP exclusive to the Switch in the first month of its life. It went on to sell that much at least. I believe it was like 100,000 in the first year, which is still nuts. That developer was eating after selling that many copies. But we also know that Bomberman R sold 2 million copies. It was definitely not just Breath of the Wild people were buying. On that launch day, even, Disgaea 5 launched in Japan. It didn't launch globally until May, but people were importing it because they wanted that next big Switch game. There was this AA revival when the Switch launched. People were just buying indie games and smaller games like Bomberman and Puyo Puyo Tetris, but it was so fascinating. It's very rare now that nearly the entire user base was focusing on a game like Puyo Puyo Tetris. When the second game came out, Puyo Puyo Tetris 2, It felt like we're kind of back in that niche again. But with the first game, it was like a highlight of the system. It was so fascinating to see. And yeah, let's talk a bit more about Fast RMX as well. That was a launch title. You could get Breath of the Wild Day 1 to Switch if you wanted to, Bomberman R, Shovel Knight, and games like Fast RMX, which honestly was the most beautiful game on the system. That was the hardware showcase. That was the game you pulled out to show people what this little handheld could do. It was this super fast racing game at 60 FPS, 1080p, and there was a version on Wii U, Fast Racing Neo, but this was just more beautiful, it handled better, there were more courses, people were actually playing online, and that's the thing as well, is both Bomberman and Fast RMX were big go-to online games. So you had Breath of the Wild as your big single-player game, but when you wanted, just to sit down and play a quick game or two, Fast RMX or Bomberman may have been your go-tos. And at the end of March, Sumo Digital gave us Snake Pass, which was the first Unreal Engine 4 game on the Switch. And so there were a lot of eyes on this. It was like the Switch is handling the go-to modern engine for PS4 and Xbox One games, and it looks good. And Snake Pass itself was a super experimental game, and I remember my wife and I actually adored it. I know there's a bit of a mixed reception across some people, but I found so much fun just trying to grip onto things and slowly maneuver your way through a course. It was very unique, while also being a technical showcase for the Switch itself. But let me just go over a bunch of games that released in the first month. So we're counting the beginning of March until around the end of April. Just a 1 month-ish span. We got games such as Puyo Puyo Tetris, Kamiko, Graceful Explosion Machine, Snake Pass, Fast RMX, Disgaea 5 Complete, Snipperclips, Shovel Knight, I Am Setsuna, Bomberman R, Blaster Master Zero, Wonder Boy Dragon's Trap, Tumbleseed, and it just goes on and on and on. And then, of course, we also got Mario Kart 8 Deluxe at the end of April, and that was the big Switch game overall. That's the Switch game that sold the most. But if you were a diehard Nintendo fan, you'd probably played that already, and I imagine most Switch early adopters were those people. But I feel like it's just revisionism to say that there was nothing to play between Breath of the Wild and Mario Kart, because there was a lot. And it kind of made the Switch into that indie platform, which just sprouted and sprouted when Stardew Valley and Hollow Knight and so many others came to it. But that indie flair was there from the first day. It was clear that the Switch was just this machine that you wanted to play everything on. You wanted to play the big Breath of the Wild games. You wanted to play the small indies like Kamiko, and just everything in between. But it just goes to show that interest in AA wasn't just people digging to play anything. That's what they wanted to play. And the fact that the library was limited certainly helped. That's the reason so many of these games sold so well. I mean, Snipperclips, in 1 month, sold 350,000 copies. That's the reported sales from April 2017. We don't know what it's sold since then, but that was before the boxed... Let me find it here. Where'd I put Snipperclips? That was before the boxed Snipperclips Plus hit retail. It was just an eShop game at that point. And this was kind of like the go-to Joy-Con showcase. I mean, 1-2 Switch showed you stuff like HD Rumble, and I guess you could use them for Fast RMX and Bomberman, but as a co-op game, like this was like you turn the Joy-Con on its side, and suddenly you have like 2 controllers for both people. It was just a really, really cool game, and a lot of people gravitated to it, and it is a Nintendo IP. It's made by SFB Games, who also made Crow Country, which is a brilliant game, and the Detective Grimoire games, and a bunch more. But this definitely was part of giving the Switch's identity from the offset. But this is just to say that the Switch has far more in its first year than I think is generally documented. Like, how many people nowadays talk about... my boxes are a mess over here. Like Ultra Street Fighter 2, right? Like, this was a pretty big game, honestly. Which is really silly to say, because it's just a new version of a 90s fighter. But this was like in the Super Bowl commercial for the Switch. There were a lot of eyes on this thing. And it sold 500,000 copies, which is pretty nuts, especially because the following year, they released the 30th Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, which had like 6 versions of Street Fighter 2, making this one kind of obsolete. But being able to play Street Fighter 2 online in the first couple of months of the system's life actually did have a lot of value, and a lot of people were doing it. Online was like really populated. People just really wanted to play as Evil Ryu and Violent Ken. What can I tell you? When you look at the Switch's 2017, its opening year, and you say, like, that system got its 3D Zelda, its 3D Mario, its big multiplayer game, its big RPG, all in 1 year, you would say, whoa, like most Nintendo systems spread that stuff out through all its life cycle, especially when it's original games, like 3D Mario, 3D Zelda, and all of that. That's not something you usually just put out there in 1 year. That's impressive. But it's also lacking variety, and it's lacking things like Golf Story, huh? Golf Story's so good, man. And games like Sonic Mania, that was 2017. We got Nintendo Archives in 2017, getting like Arcade Donkey Kong on a home console for the first time. That was rad. There's a lot of stuff that is unfortunately left to the wayside in memories. We focus on the big stuff. But that's not what made that year so cool. It was the fact that we always had something to play. We weren't waiting, like, we didn't finish a game and then wait a month for the next game. That wasn't the reality of it. There was always something cool on the eShop, and it was curated to a point where it was pretty much always a high-quality thing. People joked about games like Room in the Night Sky, because obviously that was one of the lesser Switch games, but that's just a normal Tuesday now. We have a million Room in the Night Skies. That game is... It's just normal now. But back then, it's like, huh, look at this lower quality Switch game. What a concept. But most things launching were big. They were big quality games almost all the time. And because of the smaller scope, people were playing them. People were buying them. They were selling incredibly well. People were buying games like Timbleseed and Thimbleweed, which are different games. And we were just seeing success story after success story. It felt like indies were just flourishing on the Switch. And that's something that we don't see so much these days because there's just so much out there. There's too much out there. But with this Razer focus, it just felt like every release was kind of an event, no matter how big it was. And I think that's what made the Switch so special, is it just felt like game. So you gotta remember, we weren't waiting a month every time we finished a game. It wasn't like, oh, I finished Fire Emblem Warriors, guess I gotta wait for Xenoblade 2. No, it wasn't like that at all. There was always something. So let me know what game defined early Switch to you. A game that wasn't just, the big Nintendo game. Let's take Nintendo out of the equation. Let's take the big third parties out of the equation. Let's just look at the smaller eShop games. What defined the Switch for you in that year? For me, I think Golf Story went down as like one of my favorite games of that year. I thought it was so charming, and it's a shame that Sports Story didn't quite live up, but Golf Story was just this wonderful, wonderful game. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.